The Chevrolet Vega was supposed to be the sensible answer to imported economy cars. It arrived with a four-cylinder engine, compact dimensions, and the promise that General Motors had finally learned how to build small. Then hot rodders looked at the empty space under the hood and had a different thought. What if we removed the sensible part? Within a year, backyard builders, speed shops, and Chevrolet dealers were installing small block V8 engines into Vegas that weighed barely more than 2,500 pounds. Then motion performance went completely feral and pushed a 454 cubic inch big block into one. On the drag strip, Bill Grumpy Jenkins used a small block Vega to make the heavy factory muscle cars of early pro stock look like parade floats. His car won 6 of 7 national events in 1972 and helped change professional drag racing forever. The factory Vega became famous for rust, overheating, and an aluminium engine with a complicated relationship to remaining alive. The V8 Vega became famous for something else: humiliating cars that looked much tougher. Lordstown, Ohio, 1970. Chevrolet was preparing a new subcompact for a market that suddenly mattered. Volkswagen, Toyota, Datsun, and other imports had shown that American buyers would purchase small cars if those cars were economical, practical, and did not require a driveway the size of Nebraska. General Motors wanted a modern response. The Vega used rear-wheel drive, a clean hatchback shape, compact unibody construction, and a new overhead cam four-cylinder engine with an aluminum block. The base engine displaced 140 cubic inches and produced around 90 horsepower. A higher output version offered more. Neither turned the Vega into a muscle car, but that was not the assignment. The assignment was fuel economy, useful space, and civilized road manners. Early reviews were enthusiastic. Motor Trend named the Vega its 1971 Car of the Year. Testers praised the handling, styling, visibility, and the way the car felt more substantial than some imported rivals. For a brief moment, Chevrolet appeared to have built the American small car everyone had been waiting for. Then reality began removing the wrapping paper. The Vega's engine used an aluminum block with silicon-rich cylinder surfaces rather than conventional iron cylinder liners. It was an ambitious design, light and advanced, but overheating could damage the bores and cylinder head sealing. Oil consumption became notorious on neglected or overheated cars. Rust was another problem. Some Vegas appeared to regard paint as a temporary shipping material. Front fenders, body seams, and hidden areas could corrode with impressive enthusiasm, especially in regions that used road salt. There were recalls, warranty repairs, production quality problems, and a public reputation that became difficult to reverse. The Vega was not universally terrible. A properly maintained later car could provide decent service, and Chevrolet improved cooling, corrosion protection, and engine durability over the production run. That is the honest part people often skip because it interferes with a good disaster story. But the damage was done. A cheap used Vega became easy to find, and hot rodders loved two things more than almost anything else: low weight and somebody else's depreciation. The hatchback body looked sporty, the car was rear-wheel drive, the engine sat in front. Chevrolet small block V8 engines were everywhere. Junkyards, speed shops, dealerships, and garages across America already understood them. The Vega did not need to become a better economy car. It needed to become a worse idea. Chevrolet engineers had already explored that possibility. A factory experimental Vega received an all-aluminum small block V8, enlarged to roughly 302 cubic inches, and connected to a turbo-hydromatic automatic transmission. Hot Rod magazine tested the car in 1972. It ran the quarter mile in 13.97 seconds. That number needs context. By 1972, compression ratios had fallen, emissions rules were tightening, insurance costs were hurting performance sales, and many famous muscle cars had become heavier and slower. A small Vega running in the 13s could embarrass plenty of showroom performance cars while carrying groceries beneath the hatch. Chevrolet did not put that aluminum V8 Vega into production. The special engine was too exotic and too scarce, and the business case was weak. But the test proved the shape of the answer. The Vega did not require 450 horsepower to become fast. It required enough engine to exploit the weight. Hot rodders understood immediately. Don Hardy operated from Floydada, Texas, far from the usual performance centers in Southern California and Detroit. He had already built serious drag racing chassis variety, including funny cars and Gary Kimball's early small block Vega Pro Stock machine, then Hardy created a street conversion package called the Super Twister Kit. The kit was not a handwritten note saying, "Find a hammer and remain optimistic." It included engine mounts, a tubular transmission crossmember, stronger front springs, spacers, clutch hardware where required, fuel line pieces, and special headers built for the tight Vega engine bay. Those headers were essential because normal small block exhaust manifolds would not fit. The oil pan and steering linkage also wanted the same piece of real estate, which is common in engine swaps. The car and engine begin as strangers, then immediately argue about the bathroom. Hardy's solution required the steering arms to be bent downward by about 3/4 of an inch, so the cross linkage could pass beneath the oil pan. The drive shaft had to be shortened. A short water pump and specific pulley arrangement helped create room at the front. The finished pilot car used a mild 2-barrel 350 and an automatic transmission. Its weight increased from roughly 2,480 pounds to 2,600. Only about 120 pounds had been added overall. That sounds almost suspiciously reasonable. The bigger issue was where the weight went. The front axle load increased substantially, so the kit used stronger springs and spacers to restore ride height. Hardy recommended a heavy-duty radiator, and serious competition use demanded a stronger rear axle. Still, the basic conversion was remarkably neat. Stock wiring could remain. The steering effort stayed manageable. The car retained decent street manners, at least by the standards of a machine assembled during an era when shoulder belts were considered a personality choice. This changed everything. Before the kit, a V8 Vega was a fabrication project for someone with time, tools, and a willingness to discover new forms of profanity. After the kit, the swap became repeatable. You could purchase the hard parts, use a common Chevrolet engine and transmission, and build a compact car with a power-to-weight ratio that large muscle cars struggled to match. A small block Vega did not need the rarest engine in the catalog. A mild 350 could make it quick. An LT1, solid lifter small block, or modified street engine could make it violent. And because the Vega looked ordinary from a distance, it became a perfect street sleeper. The rear tires were often the first confession. Then came the exhaust note. By that point, the driver in the big block Chevelle beside it had already made a financially irresponsible wager. Performance shops and dealers noticed. Skuncio Chevrolet in Greenville, Rhode Island, marketed an LT1-powered Vega conversion. The idea was simple enough to explain and difficult enough to drive badly. Take Chevrolet's lightweight subcompact. Install the high-performance 350 from the Corvette and Camaro family. Upgrade the springs, cooling, drivetrain, and rear axle. Then hand the keys to a customer who had probably spent the entire sales conversation nodding too quickly. Period road impressions show the conflict inside these conversions. The acceleration could be excellent. Reliability could be surprisingly good when the installation was done properly. But suspension tuning and brakes did not automatically become brilliant merely because the engine bay had gained several cylinders. One magazine writer recalled driving a Skuncio LT1 Vega that worked reliably but had an overly stiff suspension and brakes that were seriously inadequate. He sailed through more than one stop sign despite having no ambition to become local news. That is the honesty beat. A V8 Vega could humiliate a muscle car in a straight line. It could also humiliate its owner at the next corner if the build ignored brakes, tires, cooling, chassis strength, and weight distribution. Horsepower is not a complete vehicle development program. It is one department, and that department has terrible handwriting. The most famous street conversions came from motion performance on Long Island. Joel Rosen had built his reputation creating brutally fast Chevrolet supercars through the Baldwin Motion Partnership. Corvettes, Camaros, Chevelles, and Novas arrived at motion performance and left with larger engines, aggressive gearing, fiberglass pieces, and performance guarantees that made insurance agents stare out of windows. The Vega offered a new opportunity. It was cheap, light, and available just as Detroit's factory muscle era was fading. Emissions rules, fuel concerns, insurance pressure, and lower compression had reduced the showroom choices. Rosen's response was not to write a sad letter about the good old days. Motion began installing 350 cubic inch V8 engines into Vegas. These Super Vegas combined small block power with upgraded mounts, springs, cooling, exhaust, transmissions, rear axles, wheels, and tires. The exact specifications varied because conversion cars were often built to customer order. That variety also creates a problem today. Genuine motion history matters enormously, and not every striped Vega with a large air cleaner is what the seller's story claims. Documentation is worth more than a glove box full of dramatic adjectives. The small block Motion Vega made sense in a dangerous way. A Chevrolet 350 was compact enough to fit with conversion hardware. Parts were available. Tuning knowledge was everywhere. The car remained relatively light. Then customers began asking Rosen for a big block. Apparently, the small block Vega had left too much unused terror in the world. Rosen initially understood the challenge. A cast iron Chevrolet big block was wider, longer, and much heavier than the Vega's original four-cylinder. The engine bay had not been designed for a 454. It had barely been designed for mechanics with adult-sized hands. But the requests continued, so Motion built what became known as the King Kong Vega. The car began as a Vega GT and received a solid cam 454 cubic inch V8. The firewall required surgery around the bell housing. Conventional side mounts would not work with the headers, so Motion created a front saddle mount similar in concept to early Corvette engine mounting. The transmission crossmember moved rearward. A shortened drive shaft connected to a narrowed Chevrolet 12-bolt rear axle with steep 4.56 gears. Motion installed stronger front springs, adjustable Koni shocks, large rear tires, traction equipment, a custom radiator, and a large cooling fan. The completed car weighed around 3,100 pounds. That was much heavier than a small block Vega, but still light for a street car carrying 454 cubic inches of Chevrolet torque. The 4-speed transmission made traction almost theoretical. A period writer said full throttle shifts could break the rear tires loose through high gear. That is not acceleration. That is the drivetrain sending written complaints to the pavement. The car was not timed because the engine was fresh, but the writer estimated that with slicks and traction, it should run at least in the high 11s. A high 11-second street car in 1973 was serious machinery. Many celebrated muscle cars were nowhere close, especially in stock form on street tires. The King Kong Vega could therefore humiliate muscle cars in the most literal hot rod sense. It had more engine, less weight, and absolutely no respect for traditional hierarchy. The giant Chevelle, Roadrunner, or Torino looked like the natural predator. The Vega looked like lunch, then lunch opened the throttle. But the big block conversion also exposed every weakness in the idea. The engine added roughly 400 pounds compared with the original aluminum four-cylinder. Cooling was marginal in hot traffic, even with a custom radiator and large fan. Space around the engine was nearly non-existent. Braking, front suspension, chassis strength, and tire capacity all required attention. The car was described as a boulevard cruiser and stoplight bandit, not an all-purpose machine. That distinction matters. The King Kong Vega was not a balanced modern performance car. It was a mechanical dare with license plates. And there was a legal problem. By the early 1970s, federal emissions and safety enforcement had changed the environment for companies modifying brand new cars. Motion performance became the target of a Department of Justice action connected to altered new vehicles. Rosen agreed to stop building modified new cars for domestic road use. A modest fine followed, and future new car conversions were restricted largely to export arrangements. The legendary era of new Baldwin Motion supercars ended. The government did not ban hot rodding. Owners could still modify used cars, race cars could still be built, and conversion parts continued to exist. But the business model of selling a brand new emissions-certified car and then replacing major components had become much more difficult. That was only one front in the Vega revolution. While street builders were hiding V8 engines beneath stock hoods, professional drag racers were turning the Vega body into a weapon against the entire muscle car formula. If you enjoy Detroit's strangest performance stories, subscribe. The next part is where the little economy car stops embarrassing individual muscle cars and begins making them obsolete. NHRA created Pro Stock in 1970. The class was intended for professional door cars based on production models. Early Pro Stock machines still had a great deal in common with showroom muscle cars. Camaros, Plymouth Barracudas, Dodge Challengers, and other full-bodied cars used heavily modified factory-style suspension and enormous engines. Bill Jenkins won the first Pro Stock national event at the 1970 Winter Nationals with a big block Camaro. His car became the first Pro Stock machine to run a 9-second pass. Jenkins was known as Grumpy because he had little interest in decorative conversation. He was an engine builder, tuner, and problem solver who treated racing rules as engineering suggestions written by the competition. By the end of 1971, Chrysler's Hemi cars had become extremely difficult to beat. NHRA changed the rules for 1972, allowing smaller wedge engine combinations to run at lighter minimum weights. Jenkins saw the opening. Instead of building another heavy Camaro around a large engine, he selected the Chevrolet Vega and a small block. Grumpy's toy Eins used a 331 cubic inch Chevrolet V8 built from a bored 327 block. The car was constructed specifically for the new weight rules and carried far less mass than the big muscle cars that had defined the class. At the 1972 Winter Nationals, the new Vega initially struggled. It qualified poorly while Jenkins worked through the chassis setup. Then the car came alive. Jenkins adjusted the suspension, found the launch, and won the event. He went on to win 6 of the 7 NHRA national events that season. The small block produced roughly 580 to 585 horsepower by the end of the year. The combination was devastating because Jenkins did not chase the largest engine. He chased the best relationship between power, weight, traction, and the rules. The heavy muscle cars had the visual authority. The Vega had mathematics. Mathematics is less dramatic in photographs, but it is terribly rude at the finish line. The Vega's success inspired other racers. Small cars, including the Ford Pinto and AMC Gremlin, became serious Pro Stock platforms. The class began moving away from modified showroom muscle cars and towards specialized race machines wearing production identities. Jenkins's 1972 Vega still retained more original style structure than later cars, but it had already changed the direction. Then he pushed the idea further. For 1974, Jenkins built Grumpy's Toy 11. This Vega used a full tube frame chassis, a McPherson strut front suspension, a purpose-built 3-link rear suspension, dry sump oiling, a Lenco transmission, and a heavy-duty Dana rear axle. The 331 cubic inch engine turned more than 9,000 revolutions per minute and produced as much as 680 horsepower. The body still looked like a Vega. The engineering underneath had moved into another universe. This was not a modified street Vega. It was not a Don Hardy kit with slicks. It was a professional race car using Vega body panels and silhouette. Saying a showroom Vega dominated Pro Stock would be like saying your grandfather's raincoat won the Kentucky Derby because a jockey wore something similar. Still, the choice of body mattered. The compact Vega gave racers useful proportions, lower frontal area, light bodywork, and a shape that fans could recognize. Jenkins's success made it one of the defining drag racing bodies of the decade. Vega funny cars also multiplied. NHRA has documented hundreds of Vega entries in historical records, even though official national event wins were fewer than the car's enormous visual presence suggests. That is another useful correction. The Vega did not win every race in every class. It simply appeared everywhere, launched with the front wheels in the air, and became one of the images people remember when they picture 1970s drag racing. In Pro Stock, Jenkins's contribution was deeper. His later tube frame Vega helped accelerate the move toward pure racing chassis beneath production shape bodies. Professional door car racing would never return to the simple formula of a mostly factory shell with a large engine and suspension modifications. The stock car had become a silhouette. The terrible little economy car had helped create the modern professional race car. Meanwhile, back on the street, the V8 Vega Vega became a hot rodding institution. Companies such as Don Hardy, Hooker, Hetman, Moroso, and others supplied mounts, headers, chassis pieces, cooling parts, and rear suspension solutions. Builders learned which oil pans cleared, which transmissions fit, how to route exhaust, and where the unibody needed reinforcement. The formula spread because it was understandable. Find a Vega or related H-body, install a small block, add a stronger transmission and rear axle. Upgrade cooling, springs, brakes, tires, and chassis strength. Remove unnecessary weight. Try not to meet your ancestors during the first test drive. The best street cars became genuinely capable. A well-built small block Vega could retain reasonable balance, especially with aluminum engine components and careful suspension work. The worst cars were rolling shortcuts. Some kept stock brakes, weak rear axles, poor cooling, improvised engine mounts, and tires that belonged on a garden cart. The owner would proudly announce 400 horsepower while the steering column quietly updated its will. That difference explains why surviving V8 Vegas vary so widely in quality and value. A conversion done by a respected period shop with documentation is historically important. A home-built car can be equally enjoyable if the workmanship is excellent. A poorly executed swap with fresh paint is not a bargain. It is evidence wearing clear coat. Inspect the front structure, frame rails, suspension mounting points, rear control arm areas, transmission tunnel, cooling system, brake conversion, wiring, fuel system, and axle installation. Then inspect them again after the seller stops talking. Rust adds another challenge because the Vega's original body was already vulnerable. A V8 conversion places more load into a shell that may have spent decades turning into reddish powder. Power does not repair corrosion, it merely schedules the discovery. Chevrolet eventually proved that a factory V8 could fit the H-body platform. The Chevrolet Monza arrived for 1975 on an evolved version of the Vega architecture and offered small block V8 power. Buick, Oldsmobile, and Pontiac sold related H-body models with their own styling and engine choices. The factory used different engine mounts, cooling arrangements, chassis components, brakes, and packaging improvements. The result was heavier and more civilized than the earliest V8 Vegas. Chevrolet never put a production V8 in the Vega itself, but the Monza showed that the basic concept was not madness. The hot rodders had simply reached the answer before the product planners were ready to print it. That is the Vega's strange redemption. As an economy car, it became a symbol of General Motors over-promising and under-delivering. The aluminum engine, rust problems, recalls, and manufacturing shortcuts damaged GM's small car reputation for years. As a hot rod, those same failures helped. Depreciation made the cars cheap. A dead four-cylinder created an empty engine bay with no emotional resistance. The attractive hatchback body gave builders something worth saving. Rear-wheel drive provided the correct foundation. Nobody felt guilty removing the original engine from a Vega that had already expressed a desire to remove it itself. The V8 conversion changed the car's identity completely. A stock Vega asked to be judged against a Pinto, Gremlin, Corolla, or Beetle. A V8 Vega lined up against Camaros, Mustangs, Chevelles, Corvettes, and anything else whose owner looked too comfortable. It did not win because the Vega was secretly a perfect sports car. It won because hot rodders understood power-to-weight ratio before marketing departments turned the phrase into a dashboard graphic. A large muscle car might carry an engine with more displacement, but it also carried more steel, more wheelbase, more interior, and often hundreds of additional pounds. The Vega brought only what it needed: engine, driver, rear tires. Several mechanical arguments settled with a hammer. That simplicity became especially effective as factory performance declined in the early 1970s. A new car with lower compression and emissions equipment might produce disappointing acceleration. A used Vega with an older high-compression small block could produce an entirely different experience for less money. It was hot rodding's oldest trick applied to Detroit's newest disappointment. Put the good engine in the light car. Everything after that is tire smoke and paperwork. The title says the tiny Vega humiliated muscle cars, but the final truth is more precise. The stock Vega did not humiliate them. Chevrolet's experimental aluminum V8 prototype showed what was possible. Don Hardy made the swap repeatable. Dealers such as Scunzio turned the idea into a product. Joel Rosen and Motion Performance performance made it outrageous. Bill Jenkins transformed it into professional racing strategy. Different cars, different purposes. One useful shell. The street conversions embarrassed larger cars at stoplights and drag strips because they combined common V8 power with very little weight. The Jenkins race cars embarrassed the old muscle car establishment because they exploited a rulebook that still assumed displacement was the main path to victory. And the big block King Kong Vega embarrassed common sense, which had been asking for it. The Vega did not become great by finally doing the job Chevrolet designed it to do. It became great when builders ignored that job completely. Today, a surviving V8 Vega carries two histories under one hood. The body represents one of General Motors' most criticized cars. The engine represents the American belief that every bad vehicle decision can be improved with cubic inches. Sometimes that belief is expensive, dangerous, and mechanically ridiculous. Sometimes it runs 11 seconds. And sometimes the smallest car in the other lane is the one you should have feared all along.